Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of space sustainability talks by Sichtraum, the Security and Technology in Space network of researchers. The talks are organized by Maximilian Bertamini, Philipp Olbrich, and myself. My name is Daniel Lambach. I'm a political scientist at the University of Frankfurt. Our previous talks have already looked at legal avenues for improving space sustainability, issues of justice and equity, and what European countries are doing in this regard. And today we look at what is happening at the United Nations to address space sustainability, particularly at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, UN-COPUOS, an abbreviation with which you're probably familiar. And our guest today is Professor Thomas Schildknecht, and I'm very excited about that because he is supremely qualified to talk about this. He is a professor of astronomy and the vice director of the Institute of Astronomy at the University of Basel, Switzerland. He is the director of the Swiss Optical Ground Station and Geodynamics Observatory in Zimmerwald. His research group is among the world's leaders in optical space debris surveillance and characterization. And he has a lot of experience in various organs of outer space governance. And his functions are too numerous to list here, so only a few highlights. He's a member of the ESA delegation in the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, a member of the Swiss delegation to UN-COPUOS and its working group on long-term sustainability of activities in outer space, and more. Professor Schildknecht, thank you for joining us today. And we are greatly looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Daniel. So I'll try to start with some slides to give the setting, and then would of course like to have the public and everybody asking questions. So as you mentioned, since more than 10 years, I'm taking part in the UN and particularly the UN-COPUOS discussions on long-term sustainable use of the outer space. So let me try to share the screen. So now you should see my screen. Is that okay? Okay, thanks a lot. So long-term sustainability of outer space activities, and you may have heard about this activity at the UN and in particular UN-COPUOS, and in general international guidelines. Let me start with, let's say, a view from the technical community about the international efforts for, let's say, legal people or people more involved in these international deliberations. This is very natural, but for technical people, this is not at all. So what I try to show you here in this slide is that on the left-hand side, we have the content somehow of these international, being them, they may be guidelines, but it could also be more than that. And on the right-hand side, we have the level. So we have on the international level, we are having organizations like the United Nations. We have other, let's say, international or intergovernmental organizations. One just is the IADC, the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, which is a committee formed out of space agencies. All major space agencies, by the way, are taking part in this forum. And at this level, content-wise, we are talking about principles. And if you see the guidelines which come out at this level, these are really very high-level guidelines coming up with principles. And then the idea is that these principles should be somehow implemented at national level through national legislation, for example. So it's at state level or at space agency level. That could be in intergovernmental agencies like the European Space Agency. So it's not purely national, but it could be mandated to intergovernmental agencies. And finally, at the level of the industry, of the actors, really, we talk about norms and standards. Finally, we need a norm to to act in the industry or as an operator. And there's examples, ECSS or ISO and others. And that's usually the level of contracts between industry and agencies, or it could be at the level of licenses between states and private actors. So just to give the scene, and we are going to talk about, that top level here, and in particular the top left side of this chart here. So let me give you a brief history about these international guidelines. So in 2005, the IADC came up, this Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee came up with its set of space debris mitigation guidelines. These guidelines were revised in 2007, and they were actually the baseline for the UN Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines. And I give you here the reference for concerning the UN Assembly resolution for these guidelines. 7 guidelines, very simple. And if you compare them, you will see that at the UN level, the guidelines are much more general. They have much less technical details. And this is intentional. This is not just because we could not agree on these details, but part of it is really intentional because, the technical details, they should be devised from these guidelines by the nations or states and by the actors. And we have 2010, the EU Draft International Code of Conduct for outer space activities. I'm not going to refer to that anymore. And then, that will be the core topic of my talk today, is the UN-COPUOS Working Group on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, which was working actually from 2010 to 2018. The story is a bit, started earlier even. So 2010 was in fact the first gathering of that group. And it came out finally with 21 guidelines. I put a plus here because we have 21 agreed guidelines. We had 7 more guidelines where we couldn't get consensus in this forum here. These are all non-binding guidelines, about this, also called soft law. But nevertheless, these are guidelines which have been agreed within the UN and finally came out in, with a UN resolution. Okay, let me give you a short overview on the IADC guidelines. These are debris mitigation guidelines. They're really focused on space debris and mitigating space debris. And you will see the UN long-term sustainability guidelines, they're much broader. They're covering much a wider area than the IADC and the UN space debris mitigation guidelines. So in essence, we have 4 measures in these guidelines. The first one is limit debris release during normal operations. So you should not release covers from an instrument or, just leave an adapter there. The second measure is the minimization of potential on-orbit breakups. It sounds perhaps a bit academic, but on-orbit breakups, for many different reasons, are currently the most important issue when it comes to small size fragments of debris. So the number of fragments currently, or debris pieces, is still driven by these breakups. They result from stored energy, as simple as having fuel, residual fuel in upper stages, but it could be, even batteries in satellites which are overloaded after the end of the mission. There's many, many ways how you can produce an orbit breakup you wouldn't believe, but it's happening still on a regular basis, and it's a big issue. And of course, the avoidance of intentional destruction or other harmful activities. And you all know what we're talking about here. So the third measure is post-mission disposal. So the idea is that once your mission is over, that you don't leave your car in the middle of the highway, when it breaks or runs out of fuel, but you remove it from the environment. And in some environments, this is easy. In others, it's difficult. So in the geosynchronous high altitude orbits, the IADC came up with so-called graveyard disposal orbits. That's not the best solution, but it's second to best, let's say. So in LEO low Earth orbit, IADC came up with the 25 years lifetime rule. So you should not leave it for more than 25 years there after the end of the mission. And in the other orbits, not very much of, let's say, recommendations. And then finally, prevent on-orbit collisions. So at that time, we had a few on-orbit collisions, unintentional collisions, and nowadays, of course, this is the hot topic for space traffic management. But again, I would like to mention here that the on-orbit breakups and on-orbit collisions, mutual collisions between non-controllable objects are still by far, the most critical issues which drive the environment. It's not so much the collisions between, let's say, a maneuverable object and another object. Of course, if we have a maneuverable object, we should, with all means, prevent a collision. We can do that. But if we have two, let's say, space debris objects up there, large ones, for the moment being, we can just watch the show. Okay. The post-mission disposal, as I said, the IADC and this 25 years rule is very often cited and is well known. The IADC came up with that rule, by saying it found it to be reasonable and an appropriate lifetime limit. But believe me, there is no, let's say, sound scientific reasoning or technical reasoning behind that. And the IADC made it clear as well. I mean, there was never, let's say, studies where we said from a technical point of view or scientific point of view, there should be 25 years. There were many other reasons why we came up with that. And then one important thing here is that if you do dispose in LEO by re-entering the objects or let them fall into the atmosphere, make sure that if debris survives, that it should not pose an undue risk to people or property. That's a very important aspect here. And as I said, this was the baseline for the UN mitigation guidelines. And I don't repeat the UN mitigation guidelines, just a few points which are important in these UN guidelines. There is no definition of space debris. There is no definition for spacecraft, launch vehicle, orbital stages. There's also no definition of the orbital regions. And again, this is intentional. And it's very similar to the Outer Space Treaty, where we have many of these terms which are aware at that time intentionally, not strictly defined. And I think it's a good thing to start with. Although, of course, as a scientist, I don't like it, or I don't know what's a space debris. So there's no protected regions, while in the IADC there was protected regions. So what is LEO protected region? What's the geo protected region? And for the post-mission disposal, the UN guidelines do not define a geo-graveyard orbit, or there is no specific 25-year rule. So the 25-year rule, although taken over in many national regulations, is not present in the IADC, in the UN mitigation guidelines. Again, for reasons of being, these guidelines should be high-level guidelines, not stipulating how they would be technically implemented or how they would be taken over in the into the national framework. So much less technical details than the IEDC guidelines. And this is a general, let's say, this is very typical for UN guidelines and makes sense. Okay, just coming back to this definition, just the definition of space debris, just to give you an idea how different there might be. So there's an IADC definition which says space debris are all man-made objects, including fragments and elements thereof in Earth's orbit or re-entering the atmosphere that are non-functional. And you realize immediately there's no definition of non-functional. No definition, as I said, in the UN guidelines. There is an IAA, International Academy of Astronautics, position paper of 1993, the first one, where we have a definition. Orbital debris is herein defined as any man-made Earth orbiting object which is non-functional and with no reasonable expectation of assuming or resuming its intended function or any other function for which it is or can be expected to be authorized, including fragments or parts thereof. So you see here, you know, we took into account the possibility that things could be reused. You could think of reusing these debris pieces as raw material. And of course, you see the caveat at the same time. If you're going to have a definition like this, you could always tell, oh, no, that orbital debris, I use it to calibrate my radar, or I'm going to use it as raw material in the near future. So please don't you know, define this as orbital debris. Because, I mean, this might all have legal, you know, consequences or impacts or other impacts and consequences. Okay, LTSSA, long-term sustainability of outer space activities. So, as I said, the working group started working in 2010, and it took 1 year for the terms of reference. And then we started off with 4, we call them expert groups. And the difference to the working group is the following. The expert groups, they were comprised of experts from government, industry, academia, mandated, of course, by the states. And we had 4 groups. One group was about sustainable space utilization, sustainable development on Earth. Then the group B was on space debris, space operations, and tools to support collaborative space situation awareness. Then group C was space weather, and group D, regulatory regimes and guidance for new actors in the space arena. It's important to realize this difference, because here, you know, the industry could directly take part, although even these expert groups were not at all free from, let's say, policy and political, let's say, considerations. While then the working group, which is really strictly comprised of the states, was taking over again in the next 4 years. So these are official delegation members. So there's no industry members usually sitting at the table there directly. They may be called to by the delegations to give input, but they're not part of the working group members. And finally, in 2016, we had consensus on first 12 guidelines. You know, we called them 12 guidelines of a compendium because in this whole process, there were always, let's say, 2 extreme positions, I will call them. You know, there were some states which wanted to have a small set of guidelines, which at the extreme case, you could think of were just repeating the space debris mitigation guidelines. plus a few, let's say, perhaps less disputed issues like exchanging, I'm intentionally provocative here now, exchanging phone books, let's say, but not much more. And on the other side, you know, there were a set of members which wanted to have an absolutely comprehensive set of guidelines, you know, which should cover each and every aspect of long-term sustainability. And we had always this, you know, we had to come up with compromises, of course. We were discussing single words and commas for days and weeks. As I said, this is why we said it will be a compendium, saying, you know, we have now 12 guidelines where we have consensus, but this is not the end of the story, because there was always a risk that once we would have a certain set, that then, you know, the states which were happy with this set and didn't want to have more than that would say, okay, that's the end of the process. And so it was always that compromise that we said, no, we will set these 12 aside. We agree on them. We have consensus. But at the same time, we agree also that we will work on the remaining open issues. And finally, we had, in 2018, we had consensus on a preamble and 21 guidelines. There were 7 guidelines on the table with text where we had no consensus. And you all know that the 21 guidelines were only, you know, let's say, were only agreed by the COPUOS in 2019 and forwarded then to the General Assembly. So it took 1 year to come up with a consensus how we would refer to the preamble and how we would, you know, bring that forward to the General Assembly. And again, it was because of that, you know, what I mentioned, that issue that, or the risk that if we would have the 21 guidelines, that would end the process. And, you know, part of the delegations would be perfectly happy and another part would not be happy at all, because we had still open questions, a lot of open questions. So the mandate, by the way, ended in 2018. We agreed, however, on the permanent agenda item on the scientific and technical subcommittee, but no consensus how to forward these 21 guidelines. On the COPUOS SDSC, scientific and technical subcommittee, the year after, again, no consensus how to forward the guidelines to the UNGA. And finally, we had really, I mean, it took a lot of effort to come up with a compromise in 2019 in the COPUOS session, where we had a compromise to have the 21 guidelines adopted and forwarded to the General Assembly, but at the same time, making sure that we have a new working group established, which was established at that time, but with no bureau. The idea was to establish the bureau at the next SDSC. And the mandate, and that's important to know, the mandate was threefold. First, to identify and study challenges, new challenges or challenges which have been identified by the previous working group, and considering possible new guidelines. And at this point, you can already see, considering new possible guidelines, are these completely new guidelines, or are we talking about the 7 where we had no consensus? Then second point, sharing experience from the implementation of the adopted guidelines. The idea was really, it will be very, very important to implement the 21 guidelines first. We need to share experience. It's not straightforward, you know. I mean, if you're trying to implement them in national legislation, there is a plethora of open questions, and it would be good to share that, you know, that experience and share it, for example, especially with smaller countries or countries which are newcomers in the field. And the idea was also that new questions or new items, new issues could emerge from this implementation process, which could then eventually lead to new guidelines. And finally, the third point, rising awareness and building capacity. From then onwards, you would have thought, okay, next SCSC, that would have been in February 2020, we could elect a bureau. And the bureau would mean one chair or co-chairs or whatever. It took, and you see, it took more than 1.5 years to come up finally with a bureau, or actually it's only a chair of the working group now. We finally elected the chair of the working group in this year's SDSC, which means in June, because of the pandemic, we had a virtual session in June. And this tells you a lot. This tells you that something which took the first time, you know, when we established the first working group, which took probably a week of discussion and the margins of one of the meetings of the COPUOS. This took now 1.5 years. It took a lot of, I mean, I don't want to tell you all the details, but it took 1.5 years. And it tells you that cannot just be because of the candidates which were forwarded, but there is much more behind that. I'm a bit afraid of what it's going to take until we have our terms of reference. Because we have a bureau now and a working group established, but no terms of reference and no work plan and so on and so forth. But let's cross fingers that let's say, my worries are going to be proved wrong. Anyway, so we have now these LTSSA guidelines. I don't want to go into the details. One thing is important. There's a preambula, and the preambula of these guidelines is as important as the guidelines themselves. The preambula and the guidelines, they address policy, regulatory, operational, safety, scientific, technical, international cooperation, and capacity building aspects of the topic in general. And of course, I don't need to repeat that. They're voluntary, non-legally binding. And there is, and that's perhaps important as well, there's a definition of long-term sustainability, which is based on language on the Brundtland Commission report and to a certain extent on the Outer Space Treaty, which says that long-term sustainability of outer space activities is defined as the ability to maintain the conduct of space activities indefinitely into the future in a manner that realizes the objectives of equitable access to the benefits of the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purpose in order to meet the needs of the present generation while preserving the outer space environment for future generations. And I can tell you each and every word is well, you know, a bit, that each and every word has to be exactly there where it is. So, and I think it's a very good definition. And it's, as I said, because it's based on the Outer Space Treaty and the Brundtland Commission report. It took us quite some time as well to come up with that. Okay, these are the guidelines. I don't want to go through them. There's a set of guidelines concerning policy and regulatory framework. There's a space safety section. And this is, you know, these are the guidelines which are for the operators. I mean, there we call about sharing information, performing conjunction assessment, and so on and so forth. And then some, okay, sorry for that. Yeah, then the international cooperation, capacity building, a very important part as well. Share experience on let's say, these procedures and promote capacity building, raise awareness, and I think that's what we are doing right now. And then 2 scientific and technical guidelines. Promote and support research into the development of ways to support sustainable exploration. And I think it's important because that is that's a mandate for states to support research in this domain. And then something which is kind of that's a very personal view, but it's kind of the only forward-looking guideline in the sense that we should consider new measures and investigate new measures to manage the space debris population in the long term. So this is really calling for new, technical and other measures, not just what we already know. And we were taken over by what's happening in the past few years. You know all what I'm talking about. The challenges. We're talking about megaconstellations. We're talking about the problem of poo. Is that going to be a first come first served game? We are facing the risk that certain regions of space are going to be monopolized by states or private actors, whatever. We have rendezvous and proximity operations, which are risky, and we have no rules for these. We have things like active debris removal. We have some aspects of the space traffic management discussion, and that's intentional. I'm talking about some aspects, perhaps the rules of the road. I'm not talking about, other aspects which perhaps belong more to, I call it Geneva, than to Vienna. And this is the other important aspect here: sensitive political issues. There's this gray zone between safety and security, and LTSSA was in principle about safety. It was long-term sustainability, but it's absolutely obvious that, some security aspects have profound impact on long-term sustainability. For example, if my control center is compromised by security attack, whatever, and I cannot control my space segment anymore, this will have an impact on safety and finally on long-term sustainability. So are we talking here about safety, security is a gray zone? A very important point here is sharing some of the information, sharing in particular orbital information, because of the fact that some of the orbital information is military classified still, and still kept classified. So how do you share that? I mean, in an international framework, I'm not talking about, a bilateral or trilateral sharing. Then the question, how to involve private actors in this discussion at the UN level. There's a lot of private industry initiatives, there's private industry associations, and they do a very, very good job. They come up with their ideas of what type of rules they would need, what type of regulations we need to have. And I think it's absolutely important. But at the UN level, the question is really can we take them on board? And you may know that was the big discussion when in the 60s, when they come out with the Outer Space Treaty, one side which wanted to have the states as the actors, which we have right now. States are responsible at the international level, and the other hand, which wanted to have the private sector included. And that discussion is ongoing. The same, related to the same question is bottom up versus top down. Bottom up is in the sense, hey, we have an idea, or we know how we should technically deal with that, and we have the technical constraints and what we need in terms of regulation. And the top down thing, which is states which say, I don't care about the technical details at the moment, but I want you to follow certain, high level principles. And I mean, personally, I'm deeply convinced that we need those. We cannot, let's say, we can, the same way as we cannot neglect the bottom-up initiatives, we cannot neglect the top-down, the necessity to have an international discussion. So by that, yeah, thank you for your time, and I would say it's your turn now.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. That was really interesting, really comprehensive. Everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat. Just write question or I have a question there, and we will give you the opportunity to unmute your mic and turn on your webcam, or if you prefer, you can write out the question. Same, Philip and Max, if you wish, just jump in. Otherwise, I would start with a question to Thomas Schildknecht on a particular detail about the sort of the new working group and the problems with getting it underway. You did say this tells us a lot, but without going into details, of course. Can we say that the issue of sustainability is more politicized these days compared to 2010 when the previous working group started out? Are the stakes higher these days, or what in your view is the issue that sort of prevents the new working group from really getting started?
I'm not sure. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question. I'm not sure if it's more politicized. I think it was always politicized, of course. And I remember when we started in the expert groups, discussing mitigation measures, the discussion naturally came up. What about topics like active debris removal? So we need perhaps to have a guideline saying that if you're going to use this technology, make sure that you don't make a mess, or make sure that, as simple as that. It's risky, so we make sure that if you do that, take into account the legal aspects, take into account the technical aspects, that you don't make it worse than. And at that point, no way to discuss about this, and you can carefully check the guidelines. There's no mentioning about active debris removal, no mentioning of on-orbit servicing, no mentioning of proximity operations. Intentional, because some states didn't want to have that included. Because they wanted at the beginning, I remember the discussion, there were some ideas to restrict everything to repeating the mitigation guidelines of UN-COPUOS, more or less. Fortunately, we came a long way, and we have a lot of very important guidelines now. I think the point was, in the discussion the last 2 years, for coming up with the new, and in the discussion even for that compromise for the 21 guidelines and the establishment of a new working group, the point was really that some states at that point in time, they desperately wanted the 21 guidelines because they needed, it wouldn't have made sense after 10 years to have the guidelines. They wanted to go ahead with the implementation of the guidelines at national level. They needed also, to be able to show the success, and it was a huge success of that, of that working group, in fact, if you compare the guidelines with the mitigation guidelines. But on the other hand, they wanted to prevent that we have endless discussions in this working group about issues which they would call security related and security related topics which belong to the discussion of PAROS, which belong to the discussion at Geneva, if I may say it this way. Because we had, of course, these kind of topics on the table, which you could clearly argue, no, they belong to Geneva. On the other hand, you can also argue to a certain extent always. I mean, if we have war in space, then we will have a long-term sustainability issue for sure. If you have a cyber attack, we'll have a long-term sustainability issue for sure. So that is certainly something. And then I think it came at the time when many states were not anymore ready to have, let's say, international deliberations at all. So, and of course, this working group and UN-COPUOS is about international deliberations, and it's not, it's not bilateral or multilateral. It's really multilateral or international. And some state some, were not ready to go ahead with these international discussions for two reasons. Of course, because they wanted first to implement the existing guidelines, 21. And the second reason is because they felt that perhaps they were not ready at national level yet to conduct this discussion at international levels. I mean, fair enough, you have to do your homework first before you can discuss certain issues on the national level. But on the other hand, we had these topics on the table, and I could name at least a dozen of the topics which were on the table and are still on the table. And you could also look at them. I mean, some other states would then clearly say, hey, but the only thing you want to do is to prevent further discussions, and you would like to establish facts with, facts in space, so that these discussions become obsolete because the facts are there, and you established already some multilateral whatever ideas how this should be done, and you would like then to impose that to the rest of the world. Yes.
Okay, regarding the 2018 guidelines, it's probably a bit early to ask about their impact, but maybe you have a sense how these have sort of filtered into national discussions, national legislation. Or maybe if we can take the long-term angle, the IADC guidelines and the UN resolution 2007, how much do you think these have shaped the agenda and the approach to space sustainability? And what does this tell us maybe for the impact that the 2018 LTSSA guidelines might have?
I think they have shaped the whole discussion, and they have shaped especially awareness. I mean, if you would ask in the community about the 25 years rule, I would say many would know, oh yeah, that's a 25 years rule. And while this rule was not in the in the UN guidelines, so it was the IADC rule, by the way. So if you talk about graveyards, yeah, there's graveyards. Nowadays, we have an adherence to the graveyard, the deorbiting or demise rules in the geo of 90+%. And if you look at the history, that gradually increased only because we have these guidelines, but not so much the guidelines, but these guidelines were implemented in national regulations. So if you want to get a license to fly to geo in most countries, let's say, you would have to prove that you have a concept for deorbiting into the graveyard. And even more so, at the end, there will be a kind of naming and shaming. I mean, we show, and ESA, for example, is publishing each and every year a report where you can exactly check the compliance with the graveyard audit. It's much worse in LEO. The adherence is not very good, but I think it also stimulated that discussion about all these different sustainability indices. Perhaps you will have at the end of the day, you will have a sticker you can put on your spacecraft. Oh, I agree that green is the wrong thing. And we are not talking about green here, but I'm an A+, A++ spacecraft, or yeah, why not? And because we are discussing nowadays, we are discussing incentives for private actors, not just penalties if you don't behave well. So that's a long way from the discussion we had 10 years ago. So I think it has an impact. And we are discussing, I know just from national level, if I look what's happening in the States, what's happening in France, what's happening at ESA level, and many other states, currently in the discussion of implementing these 21 guidelines, there is something happening. It's not easy. It's not easy to have them implemented. My question is not if they're having an impact. My question is simply, is that going to be fast enough? My fear is really we are going to be overtaken by reality, and it's not because the guidelines are not good enough, or because but it's because we are not reacting, we are not anticipating what's going to happen, not even reacting fast enough on what we see happening right now, with new space. And I mean, 10 years ago, nobody thought about 10,000 satellites from one single constellation and one private actor,
Yes, that was exactly the question I wanted to ask you towards the end. And if I may summarize and ask you to comment a bit further, you seem to say the conversation has progressed on space sustainability substantially, but the problem is escalating too fast for us to catch up. Is that just about a fair summary?
I would say it's a fair summary. It's a fair summary, and I really am very much concerned about this escalation, especially, if you look back what it took at the international level, and we were not able to speed up at the international level. In contrary, if you look at what's happening in the past 3-4 years, we were seeing that something what took 1 week took now 2 years. What took terms of reference for a working group, what took 1 year, already a very long time at 10 years ago. My fear is it will take more than 1 year this time. So this is not fast enough. I mean, we should not be desperate because, of course, it's in the interest of the prime actors, definitely, to make sure that they come up with something which is meaningful in terms of the long-term sustainability, because it's in their own interest, I mean, it's the only reason why we nowadays have a pretty open catalog of orbital information, because, the ones providing that information, they think it's a win-win if they do that, because it's in their own interest. But that's not enough yet. I mean, my point is, for example, we have not even starting the discussion about, this question of free access, free use of space. If once we'll have some orbital regions which are filled up at the level of the UN by one state, because that state provided the licenses for 10, 20, whatever thousand satellites, and perhaps even one private actor which was filing for these licenses. This discussion has not been started. It's an old discussion because we had similar discussions in the GEO, as you may remember. I mean, the slots in GEO, and who is allowed to provide the license for your slot over your country, and all these kind of discussions. We have not much of a regulation there. We have, fortunately, the license, the ITU providing the coordination of the frequencies, but that's all what we have. And we need something similar probably for the very crowded regions in LEO.
I will get back to that in a second. That's really fascinating for how do we deal with that. First, a question from Marie-Louise Abshagen. She asks about exchange with other similar policy areas in the UN context. I mean, the obvious parallel to outer space governance is sort of the high seas. So is there any kind of contact, either in terms of persons or networks, or in terms of transfer of ideas or learning between these policy communities? Are you consciously adapting ideas from there, or are you aware of the process going the other way?
I mean, there is, of course, some contacts. I think there's not enough contacts yet. Of course, there is, I mean, high sea is one area, Antarctic Treaty is another one, or you could come up with regulations in the airspace. So these organizations are taking either part directly in terms of observers, or permanent observers. But I agree there is not enough, let's say, exchange, because, in our community, even at the UN, we might sometimes we naively have the idea, oh, you know, for high C, that this was solved, and then there will, or for the ITU solve that problem in the frequency by regulating the frequencies. And if you talk to people of the ITU, for example, you will find out, hey, first of all, it was not so easy. It was a long process. And secondly, not everything is solved. And the same, you know, with the norms of behaviors. I mean, that's a big word, we're a buzzword also, which we're using, which is used a lot in our community, norms of behavior. And it starts with the question, oh, if we are talking about norms of behavior, is that now a discussion we have to take over in Geneva? Because, you know, we have norms of behaviors on high sea. There's there's norms how you announce yourself if you pass by another ship, being it the military or civilian, or you enter 200-mile zones and so on and so forth. So there is these rules. And we are missing these rules desperately because, you know, you can see that in the news all the time. Oh, you know, there was state X which has 2 spacecraft, and one of his spacecraft was approaching another one, same state even, you know, and then accusing that state of preparing whatever nasty operations in space, or, oh yeah, you know, this state was with his spacecraft approaching a spacecraft from another state. That's not legal, or what? Oh no, but no, that's not something you should do. But we have no norms, and you know, I mean, is there a minimum distance between 2 spacecraft where if I'm going to pass, I should announce? And I'm talking not about announcing the intention, you know, we're not talking about, hey, what I'm going to do when I'm passing by. That was never an issue as well, or never a discussion as well on high seas, but just announce, I'm going to pass less than 5 miles or less than 10 miles, whatever, of your spacecraft. But just tell you. Of course, you could think of what I'm going to do, or you could try to infer whatever, but that's not the point. So when, and it's the question is really, or the problem there is really that the way we're operating right now, I mean, many actors get very, very nervous in many situations, and there's a very high risk that there is misunderstandings of some actions, and a very high risk that the reactions are going to be the wrong ones, and that we could have an escalation because of such, because of missing rules of the road, but moreover missing, you know, norms of behavior in space. So we have no norms, and I'm a bit afraid that there is a tendency to refer, or let's say move the discussion on the norms of behavior to Geneva. My point there is simply, I have more confidence that in discussions, in consensus discussions at Vienna, we can reach some soft, you know, rules in decent time than we can reach more strict regulations in Geneva. That's my personal view. So I think we should try to keep part of the discussion and transparency building in Vienna. It's very important because that's the only way forward. And I think the LTS discussion, from my point of view, is a proof that we made really a huge step, or huge steps seen from the outside. Oh, not enough, of course. But if you would have been there in the discussions 10 years ago, and if you look to the current guidelines, that was a huge step, and a lot of confidence building, of course.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, these kinds of norms of behavior are of course security related, but discussing them not just in terms of security would, I think, help us move towards a system of space traffic management as well. There's one follow-up question about sort of who gets to sit at the table in COPUOS, in the working group. You did mention how the expert committees were constructed. Is there any kind of civil society involvement beyond academia and industry, either in the expert groups or in the working group as sort of members of state delegations?
It was not in the, or not too much, let's say, in the former expert groups or working group, but that's one of the that's one of the big questions I was trying. I'm thinking a lot about this question. In fact, how are we going to involve civil society? How are we going to involve even simpler private actors? But I'm not sure what's the best way. I think we need to involve them. But on the other hand, the point was the following. You know, these expert groups turned out to be very productive. They came up with reports, but they were working sequentially. So we had these expert groups working with reports and then even full-fledged guidelines and taking into account a lot of the constraints. And by the end of the day, the working group, which is then really the states, you know, and the diplomats, which came at the table and said, yeah, okay, but, you know, we have the full freedom to start from scratch. And to a certain extent, they did. That was not a very good experience. So how can we avoid this, the situation that the experts are working for years and then because of that missing link to the working group and the state actors, that a lot of that work was kind of lost or not taken over, or some aspects which should have been taken right from the beginning, you know, into the expert groups were not, that input was missing. So that's one thing. And then the other actors or stakeholders, you know, like the public, how do we include that? I think for the private actors and others, one solution could be, you know, that we involve them not via the individual states, that's done today, but then who is going to select them, you know? So, but via the UN or some, perhaps, you know, that you have a wider call for participation, which is not done by the states, but by the international organization itself, you know, and that we can use that as an input to the deliberations. Mm. But again, how is this going to have an impact? Because again, sitting at the table, you know, I mean, there's the diplomats of the individual countries, member states sitting at the table. And so how to make sure that they have enough pressure from their own, you know, back home, from their own different groups. And I think that's one important point. We have seen this in the climate discussion, you know. This pressure in the individual countries worldwide, you know, is having an impact on the people sitting on the table, because it's their governments back home which have to make sure that they, you know, they can cover or cope with that situation somehow, that they get re-elected after a few years and so on and so forth. And they will mandate their delegates in the international organizations to take care of that. So I think it's probably more in the individual countries that we have to make sure that all these groups are involved, and perhaps at the UN level in terms of initiatives of the UN itself, you know, of USA, for example. And there is these kind of initiatives.
Yes, and there are models in other areas of the United Nations. I think there's a multi-stakeholder engagement model at UNEP right. That is much more driven by the Secretariat and other UN organs. Right, I have one final question, but first I want to ask Maximilian and Philip if they want to bring in something.
Well, if the time allows, I would be interested in Professor Schildknecht's answer to one question, but I can also get back to him.
No, go ahead.
All right, so What fascinated me in the talk was the issue of definitions of long-term sustainability in particular. And since you emphasized that every word in that definition was chosen very carefully, I wondered about the deviation from the definition of sustainability in the Brundtland report on the one hand, and then the long-term sustainability definition on the other, because the way I understand the definition of sustainability in the Brundtland report is that it has a very, let's say, anthropocentric focus. It's about balancing the needs of present and future generations. Whereas in the long-term sustainability definition, I noted that the balancing act is not as much between different generations, but between the needs of present generations on the one hand, and the preservance of outer space as such, almost like outer space had an inherent value independently of human use. And I wondered if that was a conscious choice, because that would sort of push outer space very much into the direction of being recognized as an environment rather than just something that is used by individuals like a resource. That just caught my attention, and I was wondering whether that was a conscious choice or how that ended up in there.
I think it's what you mentioned as the last possibility. I think it was intentional that you know, preserving the environment per se, that the environment per se is a human heritage, and not just the future use of it is to be preserved, but the environment per se. I'm happy to see that, because personally as a scientist, because there's other aspects which we didn't take into account at that time. For example, preserving the night sky. You know, this discussion which is coming up right now because of constellations and so on and so forth. I think the aspect of preserving the nature, preserving the environment is more obvious, in the sense that it's not just because astronomers would like to use the night sky and future generation would like to use, but I think there is, for the general public, it's a human heritage that you can go outside in the night, and you know, not everywhere, not in the big cities, but there's still spots on Earth where you can go outside and have the starry night sky as it was, you know, many generations ago, and not a sky which is full of moving, you know, points. Fascinating for me. I'm really a space guy, you know, but that's not what you would like to preserve for humankind. And I think that was part of the reasoning why this is a bit more centric on preserving the environment than just preserving the future use of it. I don't know if that gives the answer to your question.
Yes, definitely. And thank you for elaborating.
Okay, now I have one final question that kind of picks up a point you made earlier, and it's regarding, well, how do we deal with all this? In discussions about space debris and overuse of certain orbital bands, you frequently see these recommendations that we need new treaties, new conventions, new organizations, new protocols. But I do see very little movement, practical movement in this regard. And what I hear from you has only served to deepen that impression. There seems to be very little appetite among space policy making nations to enter into any kind of new binding arrangement and to creating any new institution. So how do we move forward? I mean, UN-COPUOS seems to be useful at sort of keeping conversations going and at sort of moving the discussions about principles forward, but this doesn't help us all that much when it comes to concrete policies. But where else could these come from?
It's a very good question, and I fully agree with you. I don't think we need, in particular, new treaties. I think the Outer Space Treaty is still a very good treaty because it's so, you know, it's not so specific that there is. Of course, if you would like to have the private actors sitting at the table at the UN, then the Outer Space Treaty, that's not the right instrument, because intentionally the decision at that time was states are responsible. If you want to change that, that would really need new treaties. But I don't know. I mean, perhaps we can gain some insight from looking at what happened, as you mentioned, in some other cases, high seas, ITU, and other, areas. Because I think, or even, climate discussion. I think there must be, although, I mean, there's many differences between, traffic on high sea or traffic in the airspace and what we're talking about here in space. I mean, many things cannot be directly compared, but I think many approaches could be taken over or could be at least tried to apply to the current, to this problem here in outer space. And I'm fully convinced that we will need, and that's one point of the problem. We have no in between these, let's say, sessions at COPUOS, at the technical and scientific and technical subcommittee, the legal subcommittee. I mean, we don't have any mechanism to discuss this. We have this working group, yes, of course, but even intersessional, it's difficult because many reasons. But if we would have an institution, I would say a UN organization or part of a UN organization, which could work on this, in a different manner, in a continuous manner, and have that conversation with all the stakeholders permanently. I think unless we have that, we are not going to move ahead at the international level. There's a lot of reluctance, and from my point of view, there's so many good examples of UN organizations. People come to me and say, yeah, but these UN organizations, and then they come, yeah, but the WMO, that would be a really good example. And I have to recall them, but you know what the WMO is actually? It's a UN, okay, it's a UN organization. It works well, and I don't know. I don't have the solution because currently we are really deeply stuck in these political issues, and as I said, mostly in the issues which are related to the completely blocked discussions at Geneva for many years, and for different reasons, because also because of some tendencies sometimes of some states to try to to bring in topics which they failed with in Geneva, to bring them to Vienna and try a second time and from another direction. And then, I mean, sometimes this is obvious and you tell them, no, but I mean, yeah, I don't want to get stuck like in Geneva for indefinitely. But I think we need to come, and this is a general observation, and that's not just, in the States or in Russia or in China, but I mean, it's well seen here in Europe, if you think about the discussion about space traffic management, which is right now ongoing. I mean, on the day after tomorrow, we will have that, space traffic management workshop, whatever they call it. No, it's not a workshop, it will be declarations. So if you look at that, you see that the appetite to come up with really international solutions or discussions of these issues is not very, very big. So the appetite is more like we have groups of like-minded, and we're going to solve that, and perhaps by coming up with a superiority in space or whatever, or in this discussion, we can solve the issue. I'm deeply convinced this is not going to be the case. But I think and we have seen it in the pandemic as well, I mean, first reaction was, oh, let's close the borders. And then second reaction, let's make sure that we have enough masks. And we're not talking about, distributing the boss, even in the European Union, equally or whatever. But that was the first reaction. And I think with the issue we have now, or these really pressing issues with space traffic management and how we manage that long-term sustainability, how do we make sure that we have no escalation in space concerning space debris or war in space. First reaction is the same, oh, let's close things down and try to find a national solution. Or, if you're not one of the prime players, the same reaction. No, I don't want any solution which is imposed by anybody else. So, or even a group, even if the solution is perhaps, or the proposal is perhaps meaningful. No. So my situation is completely different. Sometimes true, sometimes not, but I think the problem is that, as I said, we see that reaction to go back to national solutions or group of like-minded and try to impose that to everybody else. And that is provoking reactions which are, which are not going to the right direction for sure. We really have to sit on the table with all the actors, and that's something which I really try to make sure that people are aware of that. And I really hope that private Chinese, or not private, but whatever, that the Chinese organization is coming up with 10,000 satellite constellation, because that would really make it clear it's not just a US thing, it's not just a European thing, it's really something which we have to solve together.
Well, thank you. This might not be the most optimistic conclusion, but I do think it's important to keep going at the issue of space sustainability. And as you said, well, maybe as the problem becomes more pressing, the political will to move forward will be generated. Thank you, Professor Schildknecht, for this very insightful talk and giving us sort of a glimpse behind the curtain of UN space politics. Right, this concludes our space sustainability talk for today. We have two more events coming up. One is with Francesca Letizia from the ESA Space Debris Office, and the other is with Eric Pellander from BHO Legal, who will look at legal instruments to ensure space sustainability. Both of them, again, Monday, 4:30, and we look forward to seeing you again there.